Hello everybody, it's Courtney and I am very excited to be a part of the MFT and Friends for the month of January. So today I'm going to be playing with one of the stamp sets from the new release. This is the Kissing Booth stamp set. This is a large stamp set and I'm going to be creating a very simple scene. So I have all of my masks pre-cut and I'm going to use these to kind of place them down onto my card panel to get my order of stamping down, I guess you could say. Now, you always want to stamp front to back whenever you're creating a one-layer scene. So whatever object is up front needs to be stamped and masked first. And being there's a whole lot of layers to this, I figured cutting the masks and using them as my guide before I actually stamp down would be my best bet. So I'm going to go ahead and line this little bunny up here, and I'm going to go ahead and stamp her out. And I'm stamping with Blackout ink by Ink on 3. This is the Copic Safe ink. And I'm stamping on Nina Solar White 80-pound cardstock, which will be linked below. So once she is stamped out, I'm going to go ahead and mask her. And this is all Simons' stamp masking paper. And next, I'm going to place my mask for the actual booth down and kind of hold that down in one place while I line up all of the images that will go in front of it. So this little banner, this little candy jar here, as well as the sign that will go on the booth. That way they're all going to be lined up perfectly. I'm going to go ahead and close my MISTI door, pick up those stamps, remove that mask, and go ahead and stamp these out. Once those were done, I'm going to mask these out again. Now, the banner was a little bit difficult, but I managed to actually cut this into one piece rather than all of those individual little triangles there, which would not have been an easy task. And then I can go ahead and line up the stamp for the actual booth exactly in the same spot as I had the mask itself as my guide. Going to go ahead and stamp that out next. And now for the mask for this one, you can see that there's a wide open space right there in the center of the booth. So in order to mask this out pretty much in one piece, all I do is cut around the edges of the booth, and then I cut one slit, and I usually just go with one of those lines on the side there, and that way I can cut out the center so that the center won't be masked, and I can continue to add things in the middle of this little booth here. And everything will completely line up. Now you can cut your mask completely in half and use two different masks, but sometimes they don't line up perfectly. And if you're doing any ink blending in the background, sometimes it can kind of show through a bit. So once that was masked out, I am going to go ahead and add this little bear here in the center of my booth. I was originally going to use one of the balloons as if the bunny was holding the balloon, but I probably should have stamped that first, and I didn't, so I'm just going to skip it. I'm going to go ahead and stamp him out now, and I'm going to mask him out. You'll see that I did not cut the entire mask for him because I knew he wouldn't completely be showing, being he's behind that booth. So once all of my images were masked out, I'm going to take another piece of masking paper here, and all I'm doing is cutting a wavy line right down the center of it. You can use any masking paper here. It doesn't have to be super tacky like the Simons stamp is, but honestly, that's what I have on my desk, so that's what I'm using. And I'm going to go ahead and just kind of put this on my hand first so that it's not so tacky. Just because this is a huge mask, sometimes it can tear your paper, or at least bring up your other masks when you remove it. So I did kind of remove some of that tack just by placing that on my hand. Going to line that up on the bottom portion of my card panel and then move on to the ink blending. I'm going to be using regular Distress inks here for my background. I'm using Mustard Seed, Spun Sugar, and Worn Lipstick. I'm going to be using a blending buddy brush here by Trinity Stamps. You can use any makeup brush or anything that you have, or just a regular ink blending tool. Now, Distress inks are obviously different than Distress oxides. They are dye ink, which means that they don't necessarily sit on top of the paper like Distress oxides do. So sometimes you may have a hard time blending if you go in and add too much ink right away. So you'll see here that I'm gradually going to build up my color. Each time I add more ink to my ink blending tool or my brush here, I'm tapping off on my scrap piece of paper to remove some of that ink before bringing that to my card panel. Once you have the ink down, it's not going to move with regular distress inks. But there are some major differences with the distress inks and distress oxides. You can color over the distress inks where you can't really, you can, but you're not going to get great results with the oxides. So that's why I'm using this, because some of these areas are a little intricate and they have, the masks weren't cut perfectly because of like the little fur and stuff on the bunny and the bear. So I figured distress inks would work best for me. Just keep in mind that it will take a little bit of time to build up that color. I am keeping everything fairly light for this card. I'm not going to be creating a bold, bright card like I normally do. It's going to be a little bit more subtle. And again, the distress inks will work good with that because you can control the amount of ink you're putting down. So once the sky was done, I'm going to take that other piece of masking paper. So this is like the negative piece, I guess you could say. And I'm just going to add a little bit of ground with some peeled paint, regular distress ink. And all I'm really doing is adding a little bit more to the bottom and kind of working my way up so that it kind of fades off to white. Now my mask was not sticking because I applied it to an area that has wet ink. It's not super wet, but it's wet enough where the mask is not really sticking that well. And once I remove this mask, you'll see that it did shift. It shifted quite a bit so that I have a huge line between my sky and my ground. So I'm just going to place that down and kind of hold that in place while I add just a little bit more of this peeled paint so that I have more of a seamless blend here. Now, once all of my ink blending was done, and actually the way I wanted it, then I can go ahead and remove the masks from all of my images. Now, your background is not going to be wet to the touch like it would be with distress oxides, so you don't have to necessarily wait too long to remove your masks. I like to use the tip of my scissors to get all my masks started and then kind of peel them back, especially if you have nail polish on, because sometimes you can leave nail polish streaks on your card that are kind of difficult to take away, especially when you've already done your ink blending. So once those were all removed, we're going to move on to the coloring. And I do have this sped up just a little bit more than I normally do, so that the video wasn't, 35 minutes long. So I'm going to start off with this little kissing booth, and I'm going to be using some E30 markers. I'm going right in with my darkest color here and adding my shadows. Now, all you really have to do to add a little bit of shading to this is where the boards are put together, just add a shadow on one side. Doesn't really matter what side you choose, just kind of keep that consistent throughout your card. If you mess up and don't keep that shadow consistent, in this case, I'm putting my shadows to the left, nobody's going to notice the difference. As long as you see contrast, the coloring is going to be amazing and the light source doesn't necessarily matter. But I am trying to keep the shadows consistent by keeping them off to the left-hand side. I am also adding a shadow where I guess the top portion, or maybe the tabletop portion of the booth, would be casting a shadow on the bottom portion. On that table part, I'm going to call it a table part because I don't know what else you'd call it. The further back it gets, the darker it will be. So closest to the bear will be a little bit darker. On the top portion, I'm just going to add a little bit of shading on the bottom of each one or on the top of each one of the boards where the board above it would cast a shadow, and also a little bit on the left-hand side of each one of those banners. I did go back and add a shadow underneath the sign because I did forget to do that first. But the great thing about it is, as long as you haven't added too much of a dark color around that area, you can always go back and add more shadows later if you happen to forget, which I do a lot. So my darkest color is the E37, then I added the E35, E33, and you can see that I left a whole lot of room for that highlight color of the E31, which normally I don't do. Normally when I'm talking about contrast, if you've ever watched my videos before, you'll hear me say that the scary dark color and the scary light color are the ones you're going to use the least amount of. It's just to get the contrast, and you only need to add a little teeny tiny bit. But when you want your images to appear light but still have contrast, the most you're going to use is that highlight color. So you're just going to use a tiny bit of the darkest colors just to add the shadows and contrast. So for this bunny, I'm going to add this scary, scary, scary dark, this W7, which is nearly black. And you can see that I'm using this very, very sparingly, and I'm only adding this to the very darkest areas. It's barely noticeable that how much I added. And same thing with the W5. I'm just going to extend these areas out a little bit. Again, I'm keeping the shadows off to the left-hand side, and I just added a little bit of shading underneath her little flower there and underneath her arms. Going to blend that out a little bit with the W3, and you can see I'm not bringing that out very far either. And then once I get to the W1, this is where I'm going to go ahead and add the rest of my color. I'm just going to blend those colors out, and then pretty much her whole body is going to be that W1. But because I just added a little bit of those shadows off to the left-hand side, you'll still get the contrast that you're looking for. I did add a little bit of pink to the inside of her ears with an R20 and an R00, again, just to kind of keep those a little bit lighter. And then we'll move on to the bear. And I'm going to be using some I'm going to be using some E20 markers for this. And I'm pretty much going to do the same thing as far as my shading goes, using very minimal amounts of the darkest color, keeping a majority of his body for the why do I keep saying R? E21, which will be the lightest color. Now, whenever we color, and most of the time I color things that are really bright and vibrant, so it doesn't really necessarily matter how much shading I put in it. You can add a whole lot more shading when you have a bright image or a dark image, but whenever you're keeping something extremely light, it's kind of hard to get the contrast because you're too scared to add too much of the dark color, because then it's no longer going to appear light or pastel or whatever you're coloring, but you can still use those scary darks. You're just going to use even less. And even the midtones, you're going to use a tiny bit of them and pretty much color that entire image with your lightest color, and it will still appear light and you'll still get that contrast. So once my characters were done here, I did take a very light blue just to color the glass of this little candy jar here. And then I'm going to move on to my pink combination. And again, I'm going to use that scary dark, that RV29, RV25, and the RV23 will be my darkest. And then I'll save a majority of everything I'm coloring with this color for the RV21. So for the inside of the sign, again, I just added my shading a little bit to the left-hand side. And for the outside of the banners, not the hearts, but I'm going to just add a little bit of shading to the left-hand side of these as well. And I lied about the color combination. I used an RV00 as my lightest color, which is very, very light. But another benefit to using a super light color like this is it's going to act as a colorless blender. So when I colored the booth itself with those E30 markers, I didn't exactly stay in the lines. So there are some areas that I had gone into the banner with one of those brownish colors. And because I'm using such a light color for the RV00, I'm pretty much going to erase those brown areas because it's going to act as a colorless blender. Now I'm going to go ahead and switch over to my red combination here. And I started with the R24 as my darkest color, and then I finished off with an R20, and it just looked way too pink. So I needed to add a little bit more red. So I brought in an R27 and then skipped the R20 and used my R21 as my lightest color instead. Typically, whenever I color anything red, my R22 is my lightest highlight color. That's my favorite red combination. But in this case, I'm going one step lighter with that just to kind of keep everything matching. So I used those RV markers to color her little flower there, and I used the red combination to color his little bow tie. For my little candy jar here, I wanted this to appear as if it's kind of metal. So I'm just using some C markers to add a little bit of shading to either side on the top portion and bottom portion of that candy jar. And for the little heart candies inside, I'm just using a variety of the RV and R markers that I used throughout the card. I'm not worried about doing any shading to each one of these little pieces of candy. I'm just going to kind of separate the colors around, so I'm not putting two of the same directly next to one another. That way it'll look as if the jar is full of all different kinds of candy. So once all of my coloring was complete, it looked a little blah to me, the card in full. So I'm going to go ahead and die cut this down, and I'm using the Inside Out Diagonal Stitched Rectangle die by MFT. I'm going to use the largest one here and tape that down so it doesn't move around through my die cut machine. Run that through my Gemini, and then we're going to fix up some of these areas. You can see that I have a little bit of a white outline, especially on the right hand side of my kissing booth, and this is just because either my masks were not cut perfectly or they weren't lined up perfectly, and it happens. So I just take a Copic marker that closely matches the background, just using the tip to kind of fill in that white gap, and nobody will ever know the difference. I did also add a little bit of shadowing underneath the bunny and the kissing booth with some G markers. And again, these closely match the peeled paint that I used. They're a little bit darker. And I'll finish off with the G20, which is significantly lighter, but it kind of will tone down a little bit that shadow that we created. So next I'm going to go ahead and stamp out my sentiment here. I'm using the black hybrid ink by My Favorite Things to stamp out the sentiment right there on the top center of my card panel here. And this sentiment is from the same stamp set as well. I did add some white gel pen details to the darkest areas of the images. This way the white gel pen will really pop. And I also wanted my panel itself, or my little scene, to really pop off the card. So in order to do that, I'm going to go ahead and layer this onto a black piece of cardstock. And I don't want too much of the black cardstock showing. I have all my cardstock pre-cut, so this is already an A2 size card. I'm going to go ahead and line up my panel here to the top corner with just a teeny tiny bit of that black showing. And then I can trim off the other edges there so that it is kind of sort of evenly centered there. So I only have a tiny bit of that black showing. Went ahead and adhered this down to a top folding white A2 size note card. That way I have a black border as well as a white border. And that is it. That is the card. Also on my blog, I will have a couple more cards using the newest release by MFT. Thank you guys so much for stopping by, and have a great day. Bye.